Hey, everybody, it's Chris, and I've got a guest with me today to share with you. And I'm so excited to talk to Dr. John Abramson because Dr. John Abramson was a family physician for 22 years, and he's been on the faculty of Harvard Medical School for 25 years, where he teaches healthcare policy. He also served as an expert in pharmaceutical litigation and as an unpaid consultant to the FBI and the Department of Justice, including in a case that resulted in the largest criminal fine in U.S. history. Some of you know what case I'm talking about. That was paid by Pfizer for making false claims about their pain medication Bextra. We'll get into that. I'm excited to talk about that. And Dr. Abramson is the author of Overdosed America, the Broken Promise of American Medicine. And his latest book is called Sickening: How Big Pharma Broke American Healthcare and How We Can Repair It. So first of all, thank you so much for the incredible work you've done over your career. And it takes a lot of courage to stand up to, mega billion-dollar corporations and call out their bad behavior. So I just want to start by saying thanks for doing that.
Well, thank you for saying that.
So I'd love to know how you became a medical and pharmaceutical industry watchdog.
I didn't set out to do that. I went into practice. I finished my family practice residency and did a Robert Wood Johnson fellowship and intended to be an academic physician, but decided that my real calling was to go out in the community and be a family doc. So I left all that research and epidemiology study behind, and in 1982 went into private practice in a small town about an hour north of Boston. And at that point, we were practicing good medicine, and the price of American healthcare was high, but not sky high. And things were pretty good. But as we got into the 90s, it was clear that the drug companies were playing an increasing role in what doctors believed to be the best healthcare. And at the end of the 90s, a drug came out called Vioxx. Are your listeners familiar with Vioxx?
Some of them, I definitely am. Some of them are and may remember Vioxx.
Okay, so Vioxx was Motrin and a Aleve, naproxen kind of drug, anti-inflammatory drug. And it had the purported benefit of being gentler on the stomach. And there was an article in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2000, a big study that Merck had done, that claimed to show that Vioxx, even though it was no more effective at treating arthritis pain than the over-the-counter drugs, which cost a fraction as much, it was a better drug because it was safer on the GI tract and caused fewer serious GI complications. Well, after the FDA had an advisory committee meeting where they reviewed this particular study, the FDA data showed that it was nothing close to a safer drug. It was a significantly more dangerous drug. And the risk of heart attack, stroke, and serious blood clot more than doubled with Vioxx compared to over-the-counter drugs. And I had followed a footnote in the Journal of the American Medical Association upstream to find this data in the FDA website. And when I found it and realized that the New England Journal had printed not one, but two articles extolling the safety of Vioxx. And at the time, it was the most heavily advertised drug, and my patients were coming in and asking for it and even demanding it. Prescriptions for it, as opposed to taking over-the-counter drugs, which in fact were safer. It became clear to me that the system of delivering information to physicians through the channels that they have been taught they must rely on was broken. And in 2002, I decided to leave my practice and write a book and explain this as best I could. Overdosed America was published in 2004, and a week after it was published, Vioxx was pulled from the market. So it was not it was not my doing. A second study had shown that Vioxx doubled the risk of serious cardiovascular events, and Merck knew that it had buried the results of the first study, and they weren't going to get away with it again, and the whole story was going to come out. And very quickly, they pulled the drug from the market. It was the biggest drug withdrawal in American history. And I was the guy who had written the last book, and this was, well, commercial TV was still giving coverage to what both sides of what was going on in the pharmaceutical industry. Suddenly I was all over national TV and was on the Today Show twice and did, I don't know, 60 or 80 national TV shows. The lawyers saw me on TV. I had no idea what an expert in litigation did, but the lawyers who represent physically injured or economically injured plaintiffs, allegedly on misrepresentations made by the drug companies, they started to call me to participate in the national litigation. So in these big cases, Vioxx is the archetypal big case. They hire experts. They only hire one team of experts for the whole country. So everybody who had a Vioxx lawsuit was relying on the findings of their team of experts. It wasn't case specific. They would have a case specific expert in an individual case. But for what Merck had done in terms of knowing that there were cardiovascular risks and setting up the Vigor study, that study that was published in the New England Journal, in terms of setting up that Vigor study to minimize the cardiovascular risk of Vioxx, and then seeing the cardiovascular risk, acknowledging the cardiovascular risk internally, and saying, doesn't matter, the class of drugs will do well, and we, the Merck executives, will do well. All of that was, that became, the lawyers asked me to develop a report that showed what had happened. Now, I was a rookie in drug litigation at that point, and I was not experienced enough to get into the starting lineup in those initial trials. But I did become a recognized expert and participated in maybe 15 cases. And my job was always the same. It was to see what the drug company data really showed and what their marketing people wanted to make it show, and how the drug companies marketed their drugs to look better than they were, and people were fooled and doctors were fooled. And by accident, I became an expert in the misrepresentation of drug company data to physicians and to patients.
Yeah, I've done a little bit of reading up on the Vioxx case, and there are different estimates as to the number of people who were harmed and or died. And it sounds like on the low end, there was somewhere around 140,000 heart attacks and 60,000 people died. But other estimates I've seen were double that or more.
Correct. And the up to 140,000 heart attacks is just heart attacks. That doesn't include the strokes, and it doesn't include the consequences of the serious blood clots, both of which were increased. So somewhere between, I think a reasonable estimate is somewhere between 40 and 60,000 Americans died from taking Vioxx, a drug that was no more effective than over-the-counter anti-inflammatory drugs. And although the New England Journal had published 2 articles claiming that it was a safer drug, and the New England Journal continued to sell reprints of its Vigor trial to Merck, so Merck could hand out these reprints of the Vigor trial that claimed to show that Vioxx was safer, when the editors at the New England Journal knew it wasn't safer. Probably 30,000 Americans died after the folks at the New England Journal understood that the article misrepresented the danger of Vioxx.
So, and this is common, a very common playbook for drug companies. They fund their own trials, and they have influence on FDA approval boards, correct? And that's how they get drugs approved. And there is very little independent third party oversight or verification on the trials, and it takes years. And what happens first is on the front lines, doctors get feedback from patients as they start to prescribe these drugs. And then that feedback translates into studies. And then those studies can reveal, like you said, in this case, heart attack, double the risk of heart attack, stroke, blood clots, things like that. And it took 5 years. It was on the market for 5 years, right? And it was prescribed to 4 million Americans.
Right. That's exactly right. So, and in the case of Vioxx, and typically it's not new studies that show the problem, it's getting the data to the old studies.
Okay.
So one of my colleagues, when I was working, had a heart attack. A young guy, surgeon, active, healthy lifestyle, no risks, had a heart attack. But nobody, his doctors didn't put that together with Vioxx because the question hadn't been raised, and heart attacks happen in young guys. So it can work that way, but it doesn't always work that way. But there's a key broken link in the chain that everybody, especially doctors, have to understand. That it came out as the New England Journal was forced to tell part of the truth about their role in the Vioxx debacle, because there was a videotaped deposition that they thought was going to be shown in federal district court. It came out in that deposition that the journal editors had not seen the real data from Merck's study. They had only seen the data that were included in the article that was submitted, came from Merck, to report the results. And the danger signs were not included in that data. The medical journal editors had not seen the real data. And here's the key, the most shocking fact I have to tell in the time we're together. The peer reviewers, the people who assure the accuracy and completeness of the articles that are published in medical journals, they who certify the basis, the fundamental basis of evidence-based medicine, the peer reviewers do not get to see the data from the trial. And all they see is the summary that's submitted for publication. So doctors are taught, it's hammered into us to practice evidence-based medicine, to only trust peer-reviewed articles. But those peer-reviewed articles are usually influenced by the drug companies, if not completely controlled by the drug companies, and their data are not transparent. So we've got an absurd situation where we are trusting the drug companies to fully report the benefits and harms of their drugs, when the truth is that their job, and nobody disputes this, their job is to maximize their returns to their financial returns to their investors. That's their primary job, to maximize financial returns to investors. And we are trusting these folks to tell the good and the bad part of the story of their drug in the medical journal articles that they control. And it makes about as much sense as trying to play the Super Bowl without referees. That wouldn't go so well. There would be some bad stuff that the players did because their job is to win. And that is exactly the same situation that we have going on with the drug companies. And yet the drug companies do such good PR and they make such a case that we're so dependent on them. And we can talk about why that is mostly an illusion. But the drug companies do such a good job of creating the impression that our health is dependent on their future drugs, that people don't say, hey, maybe they shouldn't be the ones who control the information that gets published in the journals that the doctors trust.
There are multiple points of failure in the system. From my vantage point as a longtime cancer survivor, 18 years, and patient advocate publicly for 12 years, I've learned how to read studies, and I read studies all the time, and I'm really interested in science and research, and I learned very early on that, as you said, the data that is submitted to peer reviewers, it's almost like a press release, right?
Correct.
It's sort of like all of the good and none of the bad, or if there is some bad, it's minimized, right? The risks are minimized, the data is massaged, or some of it's excluded, and because the reason is very simple, as you also said, there are billions of dollars of potential profit on the table. And that's the incentive to get this drug approved, right? Billions of dollars. And in almost every case where a drug was pulled from the market because it turned out to be dangerous, um, the fines paid by the drug companies are almost always less than the profit they made. So they still end up with, maybe a few hundred million or a few $1 billion in profit after everything goes south, right?
Correct. Two comments. One is no, but very rarely do people go to jail. And Vioxx was the absolute archetypal case where the evidence is very clear. Emails that are published in the Wall Street Journal, so I'm not telling tales out of school here, show that they knew that there was a serious cardiovascular risk that they ignored and they didn't include in their scientific articles. So nobody goes to jail, and that's really important. 40 to 60,000 people died of heart attacks and some more of strokes and blood clots. Nobody went to jail.
And not only did they not go to jail, executives got multi-million-dollar bonuses, right?
Yes, exactly. And the CEO went off he retired a little bit early and went off to teach at Harvard Business School. I hope his students weren't paying attention. The other thing is that you're good at reading studies, and I'll bet you're as good as I am at reading studies.
I'm not.
And I'll bet
I don't think I am. Let's just.
All right, whatever.
I'm better than the average Joe at reading studies.
Okay, and you're probably as good as the average doctor at reading studies. Here's the key. The key is the information is not there. You cannot see it. It doesn't matter how good you are at reading studies. In fact, this idea that learning the skills of evidence-based medicine, I think people should learn it, but it's essentially a trap. Because, okay, maybe you find out that the concealment, maybe you read very carefully and you see that the concealment between the active drug and the placebo drug wasn't adequate, or you see that the population that's in the study is unbalanced and going to be applied to a different population. So there's a link in the knowledge chain that is broke. Maybe you can see that. But what you can't see is the data that's not there. You can't see it. It's not there. So no matter how good people are, and this is a trap that doctors fall into all the time. I read the study. I know drug companies, this is what they say. I know drug companies influence the studies, but I can sort it out. But as an expert in litigation with access to like 20 million documents per case, literally getting access to the hard drives of the executives and scientists and marketers, I mean, literally getting the hard drives. You can see that there's no way to know what happened without discovery and litigation. You cannot know what happened. And we could stop our podcast here, because if people just took that message and took it to their doctors and said, do you know that peer-reviewed articles don't have access, the peer reviewers don't have access to the data? Full stop. The drug industry pays for 5/6 of the studies that are done, and they control what they say. And the FDA, we can talk about what the limits of the FDA are and what their job is and so forth. But one thing that the FDA does not do, because I was in a faculty ethics seminar at Harvard with Janet Woodcock, who has been the acting director before Dr. Califf got appointed. And she, for many years, had been the leader of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, which is the part of the FDA that approves new drugs. I was at a Harvard faculty ethics seminar. There were maybe 10 of us around the table with Dr. Woodcock. And she was explaining what the FDA does and how it facilitates drug approval and so forth. I said, Dr. Woodcock, in all humility, Let me ask you a question about Celebrex. Celebrex is a cousin of Vioxx. It wasn't quite as potent as Vioxx, so it didn't cause as many heart attacks as Vioxx, nor was it particularly effective for pain relief. But there was an article, I'm picking on the New England Journal because of its role in Vioxx, but JAMA published, the Journal of the American Medical Association, published an article on Celebrex. And it said Celebrex, when used for 6 months, causes significantly fewer serious GI complications than other anti-inflammatory drugs. And that was the bottom line, and that was what their drug reps went out with, and that's what made Celebrex a great hit. Problem was, it wasn't a 6-month study. And the FDA knew that very well. The FDA reviewers said, wait a minute, this is a 12-month study. The first 6 months were good. The second 6 months were not good. And there's no benefit, no GI benefit to this drug. The reviewers said that in their reviews. But JAMA published the article that came from the company, and the peer reviewers didn't get to see the data, so they didn't know they were only looking at half the study. And the article came out and it said Celebrex is a great drug, and for 6 months, and it causes fewer GI symptoms. So I said, Dr. Woodcock, you guys knew that the article that was published in JAMA was incomplete, and that it was incomplete and misleading because the second half of the study wiped away any benefit that happened in the first half of the study. So why didn't you correct that? Why didn't you tell doctors that that article's not accurate, that even though it fits their, it checks all the boxes for evidence-based medicine to prescribe it because it causes fewer GI problems? Why didn't you tell the doctors that that's not true and that they shouldn't integrate that article, the findings of that article, into their practice? And she said straight up, she said, the FDA does not correct medical journals when they don't present accurate data. She said that. And when I was writing Overdosed America, I wanted to put that in the book. And so I got in touch with her. And I said, I don't want to tell tales out of school. You know, this was said at an ethics seminar at Harvard, and it's not for publication. So I won't quote you unless you let me quote you. And she said, quote me. And it's in Overdosed America. So the FDA, which is the only body that gets to see the data, won't correct the journal articles. And we know the peer reviewers haven't gotten to see the data, so they don't have a chance at it. So, and furthermore, one additional piece of this puzzle, which gets to the question of, well, what I'm telling you probably mostly applies to the other wealthy countries. So how come the US healthcare system is so dysfunctional? And hopefully we can go to the satellite level and talk about that. But how come the other countries don't have the same problem that you're having with peer review not being transparent? And the answer is that we are the only wealthy country that doesn't have what's called health technology assessment, an independent agency of health technology assessment. So that would be like the National Institute of Clinical Excellence in the UK. And they would look at all of the data, available data, and they would make recommendations to their docs about what drugs are effective and what drugs are worth the price and which drugs should be covered by the National Health Service in the UK. And virtually all the other countries, wealthy countries, have health technology assessment. So that's the backup to the misrepresentation of the pharmaceutical companies in the journals, but we don't have it. We don't have it, and they can get away with it. And then one more piece of the puzzle is we're the only country that lets the drug companies charge what they want for brand name drugs. So when a drug company gets a patent the drug gets approved, they have a monopoly on the drug. Nobody else can make it. And in the United States, and the United States alone, they can charge what they want to charge. Bottom line is that brand name drugs cost 3.5 times more in the United States than they do in the other developed countries, the other Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development countries, 3.5 times more. So that doesn't just mean that between 2/3 and 3/4 of the entire global profits of the pharmaceutical industry come from the United States. It does mean that. But what it means is that in the United States, the ratio of benefit to cost for aggressive marketing is way different in the United States. So we have a far greater financial reward for this blanketing of our TV sets with drug ads and drugs everywhere and drug reps everywhere. And so the United States is in a very different situation with the marketing of prescription drugs.
Thank you for bringing that up. Something else I'd like to add, and that I think it's important for folks to understand if they don't know this, is that there's only two countries in the world where the drug companies are allowed to advertise on television. That's the US and New Zealand. And the drug companies are one of the largest funders of the CDC and the FDA. They contribute a ton of money.
Hold on one sec, Chris. Before we go on to the second point, New Zealand and the United States are the only two countries that allow direct-to-consumer advertising. But New Zealand has such an active oversight, pharmaceutical program to oversee their pharmaceutical benefits, that whereas the United States spends the most per capita for its prescription drugs, New Zealand spends the least. So that with that drug oversight in New Zealand, you don't get a distortion of the use patterns of the drugs because they're making sure their physicians have the truth. And it shows that it can be done, and the United States is not doing it. And we're not doing it because nobody had the good idea to do it. We're not doing it because it is contrary to the interest of the pharmaceutical industry to do it.
Thank you for pointing that out. I did not know that. And that's a very important distinction. So the drug companies are major financial contributors to the CDC and the FDA, these major government regulatory agencies, which to harken back to your football analogy, this is like the referee being on the payroll of the Broncos.
Correct.
Right? It's like,
Correct.
Like he works for the Broncos. It's like you wouldn't want to play the Broncos if you're the Raiders if they're employing the referee. Right. And then they're also major contributors to politicians. They're major advertisers on television.
Hold on. Wait a minute. Let me interrupt for a sec.
Yeah.
They're major contributors to politicians, and they're bipartisan contributors.
Yes.
So 53% of the money goes to Republicans and 47% of the money goes to Democrats. And any illusion that the Democrats are on the right side of these issues and the Republicans are on the wrong side of the issues, that ain't what's happening.
Thank you.
What's happening is the politicians talk as if they're on the right side of the issue, but if anyone's noticed, nothing's happened.
Right. You get this chatter from whoever, pick a side. We got to fight back against big pharma and they have too much influence, too much control. And if you look, but you're still taking money from them. Right.
Right. And then the bill went nowhere or the bill said nothing.
Yeah. And that's political theater stuff. Right. And then on top of that, you have a lot of influential people, politicians and others who may not be taking money from drug companies, but they're stakeholders. They own shares in the drug companies. And then another layer is the drug companies are major funders of the academic research institutes, and they're major funders of the scientific journals that are publishing their papers on their drugs. And then they're pre-printing and using that as marketing material to doctors. So it's like all of these tentacles are so pervasive. They have just basically infiltrated every single aspect of I guess, American medicine and healthcare and even our culture, that there isn't just one problem, right? There's multiple problems that have to be addressed, and that I guess very little progress has been made since your awakening.
That's correct. I think we've gone in the wrong direction. But in Sickening, the book that just came out in February, I make the entire argument and integrate all the components that you just listed about the aspects of the problem and unify them all into a framework of market failure. We have market failure in medical knowledge. It's slightly effete idea. It's a little bit removed. It's a little over intellectual. But what we have is the pharmaceutical industry, those tentacles that you're talking about, that's a very good metaphor, into the academic medical centers that are dependent on drug company money for research, the medical journals, and something that I talk about in the book that is little known is that a significant portion of the income of the most prestigious journals comes from the sale of reprints of the articles they publish back to the drug company to give them to the drug reps to hand out to the docs, so that the New England Journal of Medicine said this or Lancet said this. It turns out that 41% of the revenues generated by the Lancet come from selling reprints.
Wow.
And in the case of that Vigor article that presented such a change in my career, 929,000 copies of that article were sold, almost all of which were sold to Merck to be handed out to doctors. And the vast majority of those were sold to Merck after the New England Journal understood that it was reporting incomplete data. The New England Journal continued to sell it, and it brought in somewhere between $600,000 and $800,000 in revenues. And this is a big part of the story. So that the journals are part of this market failure, and the doctors' professional societies and that make guidelines, they take money from the drug companies. And the nonprofit organizations like the American Heart Association, the American Cancer Association, the American Diabetes Association, they take money from drug companies. And the organizations that determine quality indicators for our healthcare, supposedly overseeing the quality of American healthcare, the National Committee for Quality Assurance and the Accreditation Board for Hospitals, they take money from drug companies. So what's happening is all of the components that serve to deliver the drug company's biased information are dependent on drug company money, and they're not changing. They're thriving. The public's not thriving, but they are thriving. So, for example, the International Committee of Journal Medical Editors is not tackling this issue of peer reviewers not being able to see the data from the clinical trials. Why? Because they're making a lot of money selling reprints, and they're not going to get those articles. If they make the drug companies tell the truth, they will no longer be the go-to site to publish their articles. They'll go to journals that don't demand the data. So what we've got is market failure in the medical knowledge that's available to doctors and the public. One second. Market failure, and market failure doesn't correct itself. It's a stable situation where the players are making money doing what they're doing, even though the public is not getting its money's worth. The market is failing. And typically, in a situation of market failure, the economists will tell you that the government has to step in. Problem is that we have so little trust in government in the United States that A, they're not going to step in because they're on the dole too, and B, if they did step in, there would be such a political backlash for ceding influence on our healthcare to the government that it probably wouldn't work politically. So the only way out of this mess is for the American people to rise up, for physicians to rise up and say, we can't practice if we don't have the real information, for the purchasers to rise up and say, we're tired of getting ripped off $4,500 a year extra in healthcare costs for each family member of an employee is making us non-competitive, not only in the world, but in the United States. And for the public to rise up and say, look, we're tired of it. We're tired of it. The death rate in America is unconscionably higher than the other wealthy countries. And it's a real test of democracy. If our democracy works, if it's not just a sham, then the American people want drug prices controlled. And we haven't asked the question, but if you said, do you think peer reviewers should have access to the data? I'm pretty sure that Americans would strongly say yes. But it's not working because the pharmaceutical industry has such a tight grip on all these different aspects of information delivery.
A couple things I'd love to touch on that you said. One was jumping back to reading studies. One thing that I learned, I don't know where I picked up on it, but just as you learn things, uh, I realized that when I'm reading a study or an article, even a summary of a study, the question I try to ask myself is what's missing, right? And this is like what you said before. There's all, if there's data missing, you can't really get the full picture. You can't get the whole truth about the study. But I often ask the question, like, what is missing? What did they not test for? What are they not talking about in the report about this drug? And there's can be a lot of things that they're not talking about, right? Well, did they even look at cancer rates testing this drug? Did they look at heart attacks, right? What are they not talking about? And so that to me, of course, it doesn't prove anything, but if they're not talking about certain potential, ill effects, side effects from a drug, then either they didn't look for those effects, or they did look and they found some things and they don't want to talk about it. So that's just a little tip for everybody watching and listening. You really have to, this is reading between the lines, right? When you read a press release or a report or whatever from the medical industry, pharmaceutical industry, you really have to ask, like, what are they not talking about in this, right? So that's one little tip. And then the other was,
right. Let me hold on. Let me just add to that tip.
please do.
All clinical studies monitor the rate of serious adverse events in the active treatment group and the control group, placebo group, or other treatment. Serious adverse events are a recognized category of events that mean that somebody was hospitalized, somebody lost the ability to perform their normal function, their normal role in life. And that's a very important threshold. Are the rates of serious adverse events different between the two groups, the treatment group and the control group? And if you read a journal article and it doesn't report serious adverse events, A, the drug company didn't want to report it, and B, the editors didn't do their job, because readers need to know about the difference between serious adverse events in the two groups. And still, this discussion's been going on for many years, decades, and still serious adverse events are often not reported.
It is also possible, is it not, that depending on who the principal investigators are in a trial, that they are turning a blind eye to serious adverse events, that they're claiming to follow them and monitor them, but they're really not doing it.
Correct. I would say it's a sin of commission, not a sin of omission. Everybody knows that serious adverse events are a key outcome of a clinical trial. And if it's not reported, the people who did not report it are responsible for not reporting it. They didn't forget it. It didn't happen by accident.
A couple quotes. When I read these years ago, and these I had to include in my first book, because when I read them, I was so astounded. And I bet you are familiar with these two quotes, but one of them is, "The case against science is straightforward. Much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue. Afflicted by studies with small sample sizes, tiny effects, invalid exploratory analysis, and flagrant conflicts of interest, together with an obsession for pursuing fashionable trends of dubious importance, science has taken a turn toward darkness." And that was Dr. Richard Horton, who was the editor-in-chief of the Lancet. And then the other quote, which is along the same lines, "It's simply no longer possible to believe much of the clinical research that is published or to rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines. I take no pleasure in this conclusion, which I reached slowly and reluctantly over my 2 decades as an editor of the New England Journal of Medicine." That was Dr. Marcia, is it Angel?
Angel.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's like you've got former editors of these major journals coming out and saying, hey, this system is broken. It is corrupt. You cannot trust this. And the other point that you mentioned that I just wanted to quickly highlight is the fact that most of what doctors are learning in their daily practice is coming from marketing materials that are delivered to them from sales reps of the pharmaceutical company, because doctors are slammed. I mean, they're seeing 40 patients a day or more, right? And they're getting called on by sales reps every day, and the sales reps are delivering marketing materials. So they rarely have the opportunity to sit down and really carefully read the research, even if it is, biased and not fully disclosed, and really think clearly about a new drug and the benefits and risks and things like that, right?
Absolutely. Except I think you're being too kind to the drug industry because,
Well, forgive me for that, because I definitely don't want to be.
all right. Well, let me help you. um, so Dr. Horton is not a former editor. He's the current editor.
Oh, okay.
And it's a good example of the best journals playing both sides of the issue, publishing commercially advantageous articles. The Lancet is getting 41% or was getting 41% of its revenues from reprints when Dr. Horton was the editor, and they haven't changed. So Dr. Horton is doing a masterful job of playing both sides of this. He can criticize and say the data aren't transparent and we're in the dark ages, and that's absolutely right. And that makes people like me happy, and I feel good about the Lancet. At the same time, he's selling reprints, and that's probably his biggest source of revenue, is selling reprints. And that's the problem, is that it looks trustworthy. It looks like there's a vigorous discussion going on about the quality of the information. But you're saying that the docs, you're saying sympathetically that the docs are overwhelmed and there's so much information coming at them that they take the path of least resistance, and they take the stuff that the drug reps hand out, whether it's a carefully curated article that supports their product, or whether it's a glossy yellow highlighted single sheet with a graph on it that a third grade student could interpret, that's the source of information. But the real problem is it's the articles that are the problem. It's the articles. It's not just the marketing materials. In the book, I show a chart. In Sickening, I show a chart that was one of the key exhibits that caused Pfizer to be found guilty of having committed fraud and racketeering. Kaiser Health System sued Pfizer for off-label and unsubstantiated marketing of Neurontin. And the damages were tripled because the jury found that Pfizer had committed racketeering violations. And
wait,
the
what
company
define racketeering, because that is a term that most people probably don't really understand.
Well, you don't need to understand it more than this was the RICO law is the legislation that was passed to try to control organized crime in the United States. So it's an enterprise that includes three entities in a criminal activity with full knowledge. That's a very quick and dirty definition.
Organized crime. Thank you.
Organized crime. Yeah, that's a better definition.
Because people hear racketeering and they're thinking it sounds like, oh, the mobsters back in the 30s, and and it's yeah.
Yeah, well, in the epigraph to one of my chapters, I quote Woody Guthrie in Pretty Boy Floyd saying, "Some will rob you with a 6-gun and some with a fountain pen," and we're on the fountain pen stage of this right now. But in that chapter about Neurontin in Sickening, I show a chart that the medical communications company that was part of the racketeering enterprise showed to Pfizer to guide their marketing. And what they showed is that you develop what's called key messages. These key messages are not scientifically derived. They're derived from the marketing people about what will convince doctors to prescribe this drug most. And this chart shows that when you're putting your data, when you're analyzing your data, you've got to run the data through a filter that ensures that the data that you publish is consistent with your key messages. They actually show that. The jury saw that. Pfizer was found guilty of racketeering violations because of that. So when you say, hey, you can't blame doctors for reading the one-page handout with the simple graph that's highlighted in yellow that tells them that their drug is better than other drugs
Safe
or
and
no drug.
effective. Right.
Yeah. The articles are just one step up in sophistication, but they're not one step up in independence. And that, I just can't say that message enough. I mean, that is the message of Sickening, is that it's the knowledge that the knowledge has been taken over, has been captured by industry. And their primary job is to maximize the financial returns to their investors. And the system is working real well. And meanwhile, an excess 480,000 Americans are dying every year because our health and healthcare is so inferior. 1,300 Americans every day. It's like 3 jumbo jets crash every day with no survivors in the United States because our health and healthcare is so inferior. And for that inferior healthcare, we're spending $1.5 trillion a year more than the average of the other wealthy countries as a percentage of GDP. 1,300 people a day dying in excess of the other countries, while we spend $4,500 excess every man, woman, and child in the United States. It's a crazy system that doesn't work. And the core of the problem is, as you're focusing on, Chris, the drug companies' control of the knowledge.
Something you said earlier, you reminded me of when you were talking about Richard Horton and playing both sides and still being, I didn't realize he was still at the Lancet. It reminded me of that very familiar sort of gang member slash mafia person who really wants to get out, but they can't, right? They're like, yeah, we're selling drugs. We're, prostitution, gambling, we're murdering people. Like, I can't get out, but I can't get out,
Yeah, although in my opinion, this is not a fact, but this would be an opinion, is not that he can't get out, that he plays the game, I think, better than anyone else in the world.
Maybe so.
That he is effective at maximizing the revenues of the Lancet, which compromises the quality of the information that doctors get. And he's somewhat effective at telling parts of the story. I mean, he hasn't published an article that says, folks, here's a headline, peer reviewers don't get to see the data. He won't go that far.
A very political
Yes.
person, it sounds like. Very good at
Yes.
playing both sides. Yeah. So I'd love to just touch on the Pfizer, because we teased this at the beginning, the Pfizer Bextra trial. And before I do, I want to make sure we make this point that multiple pharmaceutical companies, AstraZeneca, Merck, Pfizer, Glaxo, have been found guilty and convicted of criminal behavior and paid huge multi-million and even billion-dollar fines for criminal behavior. So this isn't one isolated incident. This isn't one drug. This isn't like one time. This is a repeated pattern. It's recidivism, right? The repeat offenders. So anyway, can you touch on the Pfizer Bextra? Because you were a part of this trial, right?
Well, it wasn't a trial. It was it was litigation that was settled.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. So I had been an expert in a civil case where plaintiffs sued Pfizer for marketing the drug off-label for indications that the FDA hadn't approved, while there were suggestions that there was an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And I wrote a long a report on that, submitted to the court, and testified, was deposed by Pfizer, and that case was settled. But I knew a whole lot about Pfizer from my access to the confidential corporate documents, stuff I had not seen published anywhere. But I had signed, before an expert gets access to the documents, he or she has to sign a confidentiality agreement and say you're not going to make the documents available outside of this litigation. You can't go to the press with the documents. And you have to obey that. Otherwise, the whole system falls apart. You can't get discovery. So I did that, and the case was settled. I'm sorry. The case was settled, and but nothing came out about it. And I picked up the phone and called the Department of Justice, knowing not much more about it than you or your listeners would know about who was going to be at the other end of the phone and what they do and so forth. But I said, I know something about Bextra, but I can't tell you anything about it. But it might be relevant. If you guys are looking into this, it might be relevant. So they took it upon themselves to send me a federal subpoena, like the subpoenas that are being issued by the January 6th committee. Serious business. Guy drives up in my driveway and says, you are hereby commanded under penalty of whatever dreadful penalty to bring your computer and to testify to the Department of Justice and the FBI. So I showed up at the appointed time, and there was a room with maybe 6 people, maybe 3 from FBI and 3 from DOJ. And then there were at least a couple other people in Washington who were in on the call by phone. And they asked me really good questions. They were working hard. They had done their homework. They hadn't spent as much time as I had on it, but they had a pretty good understanding of the situation. And I was able to share with them how the cardiovascular risk had been tallied up by Pfizer to make the risk appear to go away. Now, I can't tell you what they did because this information is still sealed. And I'm not going to break confidence. And I didn't hear anything about it after that. They said, thank you very much for coming in and we appreciate your testimony. And then 6 months later, I read in the newspaper that Pfizer had pled guilty to a felony, as you were just saying, and it agreed to pay $1.195 billion as penalties, as a fine for having committed that felony. And that at the time in 2008, I think, was the largest criminal fine that had ever been paid in the United States for any matter. And yet, just as you say, I don't know how many billions of dollars of Bextra was sold. It was about $12 billion worth of Vioxx was sold, and Bextra came out later and was not as big a drug. But nonetheless, it's unlikely that those penalties exceeded the profits that Pfizer had earned. And even though they pled guilty to the Department of Justice and the FBI of having committed a felony, nobody went to jail. Nobody was personally held responsible. And something that's an important little detail in this stuff is that the DOJ allowed a subsidiary of Pfizer, Upjohn, a company they had bought a long time ago. Upjohn took the plea so that Pfizer did not have one strike against it from the DOJ's perspective, so that it was closer to getting called disbarred, not allowed to sell drugs to Medicare. Pfizer didn't even take the plea. Upjohn took the plea. So what happened? $1 billion changed hands, a little over $1 billion, but not much more. And the lesson that Pfizer learned is, hey, that didn't hurt. That didn't hurt. We can do it again. And then we have Pfizer now trying to keep the data from its COVID vaccine that was used, the data that was relied upon to give full FDA approval to its COVID vaccine in August 2021, last August. Pfizer and the FDA trying to keep that secret. It's the same story. We're not making progress.
Thank you for bringing that up. They asked for what, 75 years? They tried to hide the data for 75 years, correct?
Correct. It took the FDA 108 days to go through that data well enough for them to feel confident enough about their analysis of the data to give the vaccine full approval. It took them 108 days, and they asked for 76 years. They said they needed 76 years to go through the data and release it. A judge in Texas thankfully said no deal In 8 months, you'll release the 451,000 pages of documents.
And it's coming out, and there's some very surprising revelations, which we won't get into because it'll take too much time here. But yeah, I mean, if anything tells you there's something wrong happening, it's asking for 75 years. That way, everybody's either dead or retired. Probably everybody involved is dead. By the time you figure out what actually went on and what the real data shows. That's a huge red flag, folks. But I can just say the biggest red flag for me at the beginning of the emergency use approval for those drugs was the fact that they had such short-term safety studies, right? Because I know enough about drug development that you need many years, 5 to 10 years of really following a drug and following people taking this drug and doing trials to really determine, is this drug going to cause cancer in 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, right? Is it going to cause massive cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, like organ failure, neurological diseases, autoimmune, like you don't know. Yeah. You don't have an answer to any of those questions. And the only way to get the answer is time. So I'd like to end on a positive note, which is, the silver linings of what's happened. And, I'll start with me and then I'd love you to close. I feel like the silver lining of the last couple of years it's been very eye-opening to a lot of the public and to a lot of physicians and practitioners as to the what seems like unbelievable and pervasive influence of the pharmaceutical industry. Because most people, I think, were pretty blind to that, right? Most people have not read your books. And so I feel like that there's a new and healthy level of skepticism toward the pharmaceutical industry, which I think is a silver lining for doctors and for patients, right? Just to be cautious about accepting, because they're so influential with the CDC and the FDA and with doctors and all that, which stuff we've already talked about. So I feel like that's good, and that people are realizing, I can't trust politicians and government agencies, and maybe sometimes even my doctor, to take care of me. I have to take care of me, right? I have to take care of myself first. I can't just rely on other people to keep me healthy, right?
Amen. So second point first, I'm in 100% agreement. 80% of our health has to do with how we live our lives, and 20% of it at most has to do with medical care. And yet we focus on the medical care side of the equation. And the first thing, if people are interested enough in health to be watching this podcast, I want to focus their attention. The drug companies are spending an enormous amount of money. 96% of research is about drugs and devices. 80% of our health is determined by how we live our lives. And let's not forget that. We have the most potent tool to maintain our health. And for those of us fortunate enough to have choices in our lives, we must take responsibility. If we care about health, the first step, all these questions about drug companies and is this drug better than that drug, none of them are as important as taking personal responsibility for your health.
Yes.
Now, the other issue, I want to mix your metaphor of silver lining, because I think the silver lining is also a double-edged sword. I can tell you how bad, how dishonest, how lower than you think they'll go, the drug companies will go. And we could spend another hour on that one. But the truth is that 1 out of 4 new drugs that's approved. So the FDA approves about 30 new molecular entities each year. And about 1 out of 4 of those drugs has been shown to truly be superior to previously available therapy. 1 out of 4. Now, American doctors are in the compromised position of not being able to know which one of the 4 is the good drug, because we don't have health technology assessment and our peer review is not transparent, and the medical journals are interested in selling reprints and all the problems we've talked about here. But 1 out of 4 is. And we don't want to forget, as we criticize in the United States, we've turned the development of new drugs and the knowledge, creation of the knowledge about new drugs, we've turned that over to industry, and that has all the problems we've talked about. Nonetheless, the pharmaceutical industry has a lock on the commercialization of medical science. And medical science is not in and of itself a bad thing. Moving the front border of our knowledge forward is not a bad thing. And 1 out of 4 of those drugs is going to be beneficial. Now, how as consumers, we can figure out which one of the 4 and which one we should take, and how, even harder, how your doctor should figure out which one of the 4 is a real problem. And I think, that's the moral of Sickening, is we need a health system where we can find out what the best of medical science is and stop throwing away money on the stuff that is not better than previous therapy. And there are myriad examples, insulin being the exhibit A. But I don't want to forget, I'm an expert in what the drug companies do wrong, but we also have to remember that 1 out of 4 drugs is beneficial, and it might play an important role in our lives, and we've got to at least keep that in the corner of our mind as we go forward through life.
I think that's a great perspective, and I do agree with you. I'm not anti-drug. As a rule of thumb, I think there are definitely drugs that save people's lives. Like that's a fact. That's the truth. And yeah, but it is a challenge not to go down another rabbit hole, but there's obviously a bias toward the new patented profit-making drugs versus the old ones that worked just as well or sometimes better than the new one, right? And so, yes, again, I empathize with doctors. They have an incredibly difficult profession, and there's so much money in the drug development world, and so much information coming at them that they're trying to sort out to give their patients the best care. And it's really hard. So anyway, I just want to thank you, Dr. Abramson. Again, thank you so much for your work. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me and with my audience. I know they'll find this incredibly informative. I want to encourage everybody watching and listening to read Dr. Abramson's 2 books. The new one is called Sickening. It just came out in February of 2022. So it's hot. And then his first book is called Overdosed. So if you really want to get a good working knowledge of the problems with the American medical system and the pharmaceutical industry, just to arm yourself so you are aware if you have a health challenge or your loved ones have a health challenge, so you don't get sucked into medications that may be risky or may be harmful. It's just good to be informed. So big plug for those 2 books. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Abramson.
Well, thank you so much. And let me make a request. If you do get Sickening, the newer book, and you read it, please loan it to your doctor. Because if this information doesn't get to doctors, and I think doctors can be a bit defensive, so if it comes through patients saying, please read this if you're going to take care of me, I think that's more effective. So please share it with your doctors. And thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about these issues, Chris.
That's great. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. Please share this video with people you care about. This is important information, and we really can change the world, I believe. I really do believe, I'm optimistic that the healthcare industry can be changed, but it's going to take some action and some work. And we all got to get together and stand up for what's best for us as individuals and not what's best for big pharma and giant corporate interests. So anyhow, thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you on the next one.